Hey friends, it's Rachel. Welcome back to my channel, and welcome to another monthly reading wrap-up where I share with you the books I read this month. For the month of May, I read 4 books. I was hoping to have a 5th book to be able to share with you, but it's very thick and it's not going to be done in time, so it will just have to go in the next wrap-up. I did not have a video to share with you guys last week because work has just been... So if you were wondering, that is why. I just don't have as much time for reading as I used to, and I really don't like that, but hopefully it will get better soon. The first book I read this month was The Queen of Blood by Beth Durst. I had read 2 of this author's books previously and I really liked them, so I had high hopes for this one. The premise of this book is that there are spirits in this world. There are air spirits, for example, water spirits, fire spirits, and they are malevolent, and they want to eliminate all human presence. And the only person that can control them and stop them from killing all the people is the queen. Queens don't live forever, and so every once in a while there are young women who are trained to become the next queen, and one of those women is Delina, our main character. The books that I had read by this author that I really liked were written after this book, so I think there was definite improvement and it shows. I didn't like this book as well as either The Bone Maker or Race the Sands. I thought the world building was fine, but the characters seemed kind of flat. I didn't feel like we ever really got to know them beyond what they were or who they were on the surface. For example, Delina is training to become the next queen, but she's not very powerful magic-wise, so she struggles a lot, and she continues to struggle throughout the whole book, and then she teams up with a disgraced champion named Ven, who had a falling out with the queen, and we never really learn a lot about either of them. They don't move much beyond that surface level information that we're given. I liked it well enough, I thought it was enjoyable, but when compared to The Bone Maker or Race the Sands, it did feel a little short. I also have no interest really in reading the other 2 books in this series. It's a trilogy, because each of the books is about a different main character than Delina, or even though Delina is in it, many years have passed, so it's not exactly a straight continuation of this book, so I'm content just to leave it where it is. Next we have Darling Girl by Michalski, and I have an entire video dedicated to this book if you want more information, but it is a dark Peter Pan retelling. The main character, Holly Darling, is the granddaughter of Wendy, and the Darling family is very famous because of the story about their family involving Peter Pan. But to the rest of the world, Peter Pan is just a story, and yet Holly knows that he is neither innocent nor kind. Holly had a daughter named Eden who ages very rapidly. She has a medical condition, and so far Holly has not been able to find any treatment for her or a cure. Eden hit her head when she was young in an accident, and she has been in a coma ever since in private care. And then one day Eden disappears. It's as though she just woke up and got up on her own and walked off. But Holly knows that's not the case. She knows that Peter Pan has taken her daughter, and so she sets off to find where Eden is and hopefully get some answers. So on the surface, this book seems really interesting to me. I like the idea of a dark Peter Pan retelling. As I said in my video, I don't know a lot about the original Peter Pan. I don't know how dark the story may or may not be, but it just seems like it lends itself to a dark retelling, because maybe the reason that these kids can fly and that they never age is because they're dead and Peter Pan killed them. But I was really disappointed in the way that this book in particular chose to make Peter Pan the bad guy. I thought it was very creepy, disturbing, and really not that well done. The characters in this book are very flat. Holly doesn't really have a personality aside from being a mother, and I know that if you're a mother, your children are probably very important to you and obviously a pivotal part of who you are, but you were still you before you had children, and yet we don't get any sort of hint as to who Holly may have been before she became a mother. The only real aspects to Holly's character is her being a mother and her owning a skincare company. This book is also written in first-person point of view in present tense, which I think is, personal opinion, I think it's the worst point of view, except for maybe second person. So basically, if Holly is not involved in something, we never see it, because we're stuck in her head the entire time. And there are certain scenes in this book that really suffer because of that. I thought this book had an identity crisis. It didn't know what it wanted to be, a fairy tale or a crime thriller, and in the end it succeeds at being neither. It felt like the author had this idea for a crime thriller where a daughter goes missing and decided to include that in a dark retelling of Peter Pan, and it just doesn't work very well. There really is no mystery here, and when it is revealed what's going on, it's really anticlimactic and disappointing. I didn't like the way that some of the Neverland characters were incorporated into the modern world, especially Tinkerbell and the Captain Hook stand-in character. In this book, the Captain Hook character is a private investigator that Holly hooks up with in order to help find her missing daughter, but he really serves no purpose in this book at all other than to try to create some sort of half-baked romance between him and Holly that is completely unrealistic and unbelievable, and ultimately doesn't really go anywhere. He's also really bad at being a private investigator. So all of these little things just combine to make an end product that doesn't really work. I think a lot of people were surprised by the content in this book when they picked it up. It has some big content warnings that really are never hinted at in the blurb of the book at all. You think you might be getting a story that's a bit magical or whimsical even, but it really isn't. When they say dark retelling, it's pretty dark. There's no magic to be found here, and a lot of people were disappointed when they went into this book completely blind and had no clue as to the content warnings because no one was talking about those. I also think that the fact that this book was a Book of the Month pick is going to introduce it to a lot of people who have no idea what they're getting into. I certainly had no idea what I was getting into. I didn't read it because it was a Book of the Month pick. I just thought it sounded interesting, and of all the fairy tale retellings, I thought that this one in particular had the potential to actually pull off a dark retelling. But it didn't, and I would recommend staying away from this one. And of course, if you want to know more, you can check out my video on this book in which I delve into specific examples of what I thought and why. Next, we have to talk about a book that I DNF'd. Usually, I don't mention books that I DNF at all because there's really no point, but I'm going to talk about this book because I was super excited to read it, and I said as much, and I was misled about what this book was about, and I don't want to mislead anybody else on that, so I'm going to mention it briefly. And that book is The Unspoken Name by A.K. Larkwood. If you've seen my birthday book haul video, you know that I picked this up at the bookstore for my birthday. This was the only book that I allowed myself to take a chance on. The rest of the books I bought that day were books that I either knew that I would like or ones that I had already read and just did not own. And the reason that I didn't allow myself to go crazy is because books are not cheap, and most books I read, even if I enjoy them, I don't like them enough to put them on my shelf, which is the highest praise that I can give a book. If I put a book on my shelf, it means that I will reread it, or would reread it again, whether I actually get around to it or not. So this was the only book I allowed myself to take a chance on because I was so excited for it. The premise sounded so good, and the premise is that a girl named Sorway knows the exact moment that she's going to die. She's going to be a sacrifice for the unspoken god. So she's preparing to be a sacrifice, she's preparing to die when a wizard appears and offers her a chance at a new fate, which she takes. In exchange for helping him, she can not die as planned, and I don't blame her for not wanting to do that, but gods have a long memory, and so just because she thinks she's gotten away with this doesn't mean she necessarily has. So I was really, really excited to read this book. However, I ended up DNFing it on page 6, which is not the earliest, actually, that I've DNF'd a book, but it's pretty dang close. And what I want to point out is that what I believe to be a Viking horn on the front of this book is not a Viking horn. It's a broken tusk, a broken orc tusk. Now, in my defense, I assumed that this was a Viking horn because my brain saw what it expected to see. It did not expect to see an orc tusk on the cover of this book, but it is an orc tusk. Sorway is not a human, she is an orc. Now, that was very confusing trying to read it because she keeps talking about tusks and how adults have tusks, and I'm like, what in the world is she talking about? So I went online onto Goodreads and I read some reviews and I was like, oh, okay, she's an orc, which is ironic because nowhere in the blurb of this book do you get the idea or even the suggestion that she might be an orc. That completely came out of left field for me. But that's not why I DNF'd this book. Once I figured out she was an orc, I was like, okay, I can, deal with that. I've never read a book with an orc as the main character. I think the only book that I've ever attempted to read with orcs in it at all was The Lord of the Rings. But anyway, I can deal with that. But then I was reading more reviews that said that this book was really boring and very slow-paced, and the names... Oh, the names. People kept complaining, saying that it took them so long to read solely because of the names, because it took them 5 minutes to figure out how they're pronounced. And yes, there is a pronunciation guide, but I personally am not going to want to reference that every 5 minutes. Also, the main character, Sorway, technically I'm not saying her name right even now. Technically, according to the pronunciation guide, it's pronounced Cusorway, which I think is Okay, I like Stormwind better, so that's what I'm going to say. I don't understand why fantasy writers, especially epic fantasy writers, do this to their readers. I understand it comes from some sort of desire to make your world sound different from ours, and I guess it's just basically a sign that screams, this is epic fantasy, but it's confusing for the readers. It's a burden on the readers. I'm not saying that fantasy characters need to have names that are names that we have on Earth, but if you make them really difficult to pronounce, it's going to be annoying and readers aren't going to want to put up with that. That's why I get a little bit nervous every single time that there's this glossary thing in the front with pronunciation guide and who is who. It's just overwhelming and I cannot keep that amount of information straight right off the bat. So I just decided that I was not in the mood for another long-winded, boring fantasy whose names I couldn't even pronounce. So that's why I DNF'd it. All of this to say, though, if you're interested in this book, disregard what I said in my previous video because there's no Vikings in here whatsoever, and prepare to read about orcs. Next, we have one of the best books I read this month, and that was The Night She Disappeared by Lisa Jewell. This is the first Lisa Jewell book I've ever read, and it's a crime thriller that has 3 different points of views during different timelines. Usually I hate dual timeline books, but this one really did it well. The premise of this book is that there are 2 young teenage parents. They're both 19, Tallulah and Zach, and they've just had a son together. And they go out one night kind of to get away from the stress of raising a child and just to enjoy an evening out with friends that they aren't able to enjoy now that they're young parents. So they leave the son with Tallulah's mother, whom they are living with, and they go out to the local pub and enjoy an evening out. However, they never return home. And Tallulah's mother, Kim, is desperately searching for answers. She wants to know what happened to her daughter, and there is no progress in the case. Her daughter is still missing. They haven't found any shred of evidence whatsoever. They don't know what happened the night she disappeared. And then there is Sophie, who is a writer. She moves to a boarding school out in the countryside with her boyfriend, who is the headmaster of the school. He's just been hired, and she goes with him. And while she is on the school grounds, she sees a cardboard sign that says "Dig Here," and she wonders if it has anything to do with the teenagers that went missing about a year ago, and so she decides to dig. And I have to admit, it was the little detail about the sign that said "Dig Here" that made me pick this book up, because that sounded really interesting. So you have 3 timelines, one from Tallulah's point of view, leading up to the events that eventually led to her disappearing. The other point of view is her mother Kim as she's searching for answers after Tallulah has disappeared. And then the third point of view and timeline is the writer Sophie as she's trying to unravel the clues in the present timeline as to what happened. I never once found any of the timelines to be confusing. I never doubted whose timeline I was in. I thought that all of the points of views were unique and separate from one another. I thought that the characters were sympathetic. I especially sympathized with Kim, Tallulah's mother, because she is dealing with the loss of her only daughter, and she now has the raising of her grandson by herself because both Zach and Tallulah are gone, and there is no sign of what happened at all. I also found it really interesting to see the events that led up to the eventual disappearance unfolding in Tallulah's timeline, because you get to see what happens and what ultimately leads where it does. And I had some guesses as to what happened, but I wasn't quite right either. The only complaint I have about this book is I thought the ending was a tad bit unrealistic. But I thought it was fast-paced, I thought it was exciting, I liked the 3 different dual timelines, even though I'm usually not a fan of even just 2, much less 3, and I would definitely read Lisa Jewell books again. And last but not least, we have The Bone Maker by Beth Durst, which is of course a reread for me. This is one of the books by this author that I read before reading The Queen of Blood, and I really did enjoy it. This book follows 5 heroes who defeated an evil necromancer named Eklor 25 years ago. And during the Bone War, Krea's husband was killed. So now she's trying to resurrect him using the same forbidden magic that Eklor used. And this magic involves the use of human bones, but she's running out of bones because bodies are burned after death to avoid the very thing that she's doing. But she knows where she can get lots of bones, and that's the battlefield where they fought Eckler. But she can't do it alone, so she enlists the help of one of the other heroes that fought alongside her, named Zira, and together they go to the Forbidden Zone to try to get enough bones to bring Krea's husband back to life permanently. But while they're there, they uncover evidence that suggests that Eckler may not be as dead as they all believed him to be. And so the 5 heroes are forced to contend with the idea of, do we let a new generation take on Eckler because our time is done? We did what we set out to do. We saved the world. We should be able to live our lives in peace. Or is it a case of, well, we're the 5 heroes. We're the only ones who can do this. And technically, we didn't defeat Eckler like we all thought we did, so it's our responsibility to defeat him for real this time. I think this book is really interesting in the sense that there's clearly a story that came before this story of the original Bone War, where the 5 heroes rose up to defeat Eckler, and I think that's really interesting. It's almost as though this book could have its own prequel, but it doesn't really need it, because that's kind of the point. I find the world building very interesting. It's kind of weird. It's a mixture of, like, technology in the sense that there's cable cars, but they're powered by bone magic, and there's also a valley filled with monsters that reminds me of Jurassic Park. But it's just the characters that really make me love this book. I think Eckler is an interesting villain. He's not the most developed villain I've ever read, but he's very interesting to me all of the same. I think it's probably just his charisma and his deception that make him interesting. I also really like Zira as a character because she's just eccentric and energetic and outspoken, and I really like that about her. I originally did not think that this book was good enough for me to put it on the shelf, and I gave my copy away the first time that I read it. But then I couldn't stop thinking about it and about the characters, and I knew that I would want to reread it one day, so I got another copy, and this was the reread. I just kept thinking about the characters recently, and I knew that I wanted to reread it, so I did. I can't recommend this book enough. I think it's quirky, it's original. I've never read anything else like it, and the characters are just phenomenal. And upon rereading it, it's just as good the second time as it was the first. So there you have it. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed, feel free to leave a like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future content. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!